The acidic steam rose from the bubbling water like ghostly fingers reaching toward the orange sky. Tom Bradley wiped sweat from his forehead and stared across the endless expanse of boiling marsh that stretched to the horizon. Somewhere on the other side, 200 human colonists waited for rescue in their damaged ship. The problem was simple to understand, but impossible to solve. Nothing could cross the death waters. Dr. Ann Foster knelt beside her scanning equipment, watching. Numbers that told the same story every few minutes. The water temperature held steady at 180 degrees. The acid levels would eat through steel in hours and human flesh in seconds. Even the air above the swamp carried enough poison to kill anyone without perfect protective gear. The readings are getting worse toward the center, Anne said, not looking up from her instruments. Whatever caused this mess, it made the middle section completely toxic to any known life form. Captain Ross paced behind them, his military boots, crunching on the crystallized mineral deposits that lined the swamp edge. He had led rescue missions across 3 star systems, but this challenge made no sense to his tactical mind. There was no enemy to outflank, no weakness to exploit, just hundreds of kilometers of liquid death. We could try the northern route. Again, Ross suggested, though his voice carried no confidence. Maybe the storm damage cleared some of the acid pools. Tom shook his head. They had already spent 2 days exploring every possible path around the swamp. The northern route led to cliffs too steep for their vehicles. The southern approach ended at a series of geysers that shot boiling acid 50 meters into the air. The swamp formed a perfect barrier, as if the planet itself wanted to keep the 2 sides separate forever. A soft clicking sound made them turn around. Pip emerged from behind a cluster of blue-black rocks, moving with the careful grace of his people. The young Keth alien stood barely 4 feet tall, with large golden eyes and skin that shifted colors based on his emotions. Right now, those colors showed deep concern. "Sky people still think about crossing death waters?" Pip asked in his careful human speech. His people had learned the language from previous contact, though they struggled with some of the harder sounds. "Our friends need help," Tom explained, pointing across the swamp. "They have food for maybe 10 more days. After that," he let the sentence hang unfinished. Pip's skin flashed bright yellow, which Anne had learned meant surprise or fear. 10 days only? Sky people trapped that long already?" 15 days since the crash, Captain Ross said. "We've been trying to reach them for a week." The alien's color shifted to deep purple, and he began making soft humming sounds. Anne recognized this as the way Kith processed difficult information. After a moment, Pip looked up at them with something that might have been sympathy. Pip understand. Now why Sky people so desperate? But death waters never crossed. Not by Keth, not by any living thing. Water angry, always angry. Kill everything that touch. Tom had heard variations of this warning from every Keth they met. The aliens lived in fear of the swamp, telling stories about creatures that had tried to cross and disappeared forever. But Tom came from a species that had crossed oceans and space itself. There had to be a way. What about flying over it? Anne suggested, though she already knew the answer. Ross pointed to the thick clouds of toxic vapor that hung over the swamp like a poisonous ceiling. "Our shuttles can't handle that atmosphere for long. The acid eats through the filters too fast. We might get halfway before the engines fail." Tom walked closer to the water's edge, careful to stay back from the bubbling foam. His engineering mind searched for solutions, running through materials and methods that might work. The colony ship carried construction equipment, but nothing designed for this kind of environment. Their vehicles had already proven useless. The first transport they sent into the swamp had its tires melt away before it traveled 50 meters. "Maybe we build something," Tom said, more to himself than the others. "Some kind of platform or boat." Pip's skin flashed red, which Anne knew meant urgent warning. "Sky people not understand. Death water's not just hot and poison. Bottom knot, Solid. Everything sink down, down, down. No bottom anywhere. Just more hot poison water. That ruled out most conventional approaches. They could not wade through it, drive through it, or build foundations in it. The swamp was deep enough to swallow anything they might construct. Anne stood up from her equipment, brushing dust from her knees. We need to think about this differently. What would float in acid? What materials could survive the temperature? Not much, Ross said grimly. Our best heat-resistant alloys might last a day or two, but that's not enough time to build anything useful. Tom found himself studying the shoreline more carefully. Scattered along the edge of the swamp were strange objects that looked like pieces of broken pottery. Some were as small as dinner plates, others as large as tabletops. They had a pearlescent quality that caught the orange sunlight, and they seemed completely undamaged despite being partially covered in acidic foam. "Pip, what are these things?" Tom asked, pointing to the shell fragments. The alien's eyes followed. Tom's gesture and his skin shifted to a soft green that Anne had learned meant reverence or respect. "Old shells from great ones. Crex people who lived long ago before the Great Dying." "They look intact," Anne observed, moving closer to examine them. "No acid damage at all." Ross joined them, his tactical mind immediately grasping the implications. "How long have these been here?" "Many seasons," Pip said. "Maybe hundreds. Crex shells always strong. Nothing harmed them, not even deathwarders." Anne knelt beside the largest fragment she could find and ran her scanner over its surface. The readings made her catch her breath. "Tom, look at this. The shell material is showing zero degradation. Whatever these creatures were made of, it's completely immune to the acid." Tom felt the first stirring of an idea. It was crazy, probably impossible, but it was the first real possibility they had found. He looked across the deadly expanse of boiling water, then back at the scattered shell pieces. "How big did these Crex creatures get?" he asked. Pip's skin showed confusion, cycling through yellow and green patches. "Very big. Stories say biggest one size of sky people buildings. But all dead now, long dead." Anne was already scanning more shell fragments, her excitement growing with each reading. "Tom, these readings are incredible. The material is not just acid-resistant. It's actually stronger than anything in our construction database." Captain Ross studied Tom's face and recognized the expression of an engineer seeing a solution. "You're thinking about using these shells for something." "Not just something," Tom said slowly, his mind racing through calculations and possibilities. "Everything." The next morning brought no relief from the planet's relentless heat. Anne Foster moved along the swamp's edge like a detective examining evidence, her portable lab equipment humming as it analyzed shell fragment after shell fragment. Each scan confirmed what seemed impossible. The Crex shells showed no signs of damage despite decades of exposure to some of the most hostile conditions in the known galaxy. Tom Bradley worked beside her, measuring the largest pieces and taking detailed photographs. His construction background told him these shells had once belonged to creatures the size of buildings. The curved section suggested shells that could have been 30 meters across when complete. The thickness varied from 2 centimeters at the edges to nearly 10 centimeters at what appeared to be stress points. "Look at this internal structure," Anne said, pointing to a cross-section where one shell had broken cleanly. "It's not solid. There are chambers and supports, almost like engineered honeycomb." Captain Ross approached, carrying his morning report from the communication team. His expression was grim. "Still no contact with the colonists. The storm front is moving faster than predicted. We have maybe 4 days before weather makes any aerial rescue impossible." The news hit them like a physical blow. 4 days to solve a problem that had stumped them for over a week. 4 days to cross an impassable barrier using materials they barely understood. Pip appeared from behind a cluster of rocks, moving with unusual urgency. His skin showed the deep orange patterns that Anne had learned meant important news. "Sky, people Pip bring grandmother. She know old stories about great ones. An elderly Keth female emerged from the morning mist, moving slowly but with obvious dignity. Her skin was darker than Pip's, with permanent silver markings that indicated great age among her people. She spoke in rapid Keth to Pip, who translated. Carefully. Grandmother say, great ones not just big animals. They were builders. They made bridges between lands, connected places that water tried to keep apart. Tom looked up from his measurements. Bridges? The Krex built bridges? Pip consulted with his grandmother again, their conversation full of complex clicking sounds. Long ago, before Great Dying, before Deathwaters became so angry, Great Ones connected all lands. Keth people could walk anywhere, visit all places. Anne felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. That would explain the shell structure. These weren't just protective coverings. They were construction materials. The old Keth female pointed directly at Tom and spoke several sentences. In her native language, her tone was urgent, almost commanding. Grandmother say sky people have builder spirit like great ones. She say maybe sky people can do what great ones did, make path across angry waters. Captain Ross looked skeptical. Even if these shells are indestructible, how do we use them? Each piece weighs tons. We don't have equipment to move them, much less build anything with them. Tom was quiet for several minutes, studying the shell fragments with new understanding. Finally, he began sketching in his notebook, drawing rough diagrams of interlocking shapes. We don't need to build a traditional bridge, he said slowly. We need to think like these Krex creatures did. Look at how these shells fit together. He showed them his sketches, which depicted shell pieces connecting edge to edge, forming a continuous surface. These aren't random shapes. They're designed to interlock, to distribute weight across a wide area. Anne examined his drawings, then looked back at the shell fragments with new eyes. You're thinking of floating platforms. Instead of fighting the swamp, we work with it. Exactly. The shells are naturally buoyant because of their internal structure. If we can connect enough pieces, we create a causeway that floats on the surface. Instead of trying to sink foundations, Pip translated this concept to his grandmother, who listened carefully and responded with obvious interest. Grandmothers say yes, this how great ones worked. Not fight water, work with water. Make floating roads that move with storms but never break. Captain Ross studied Tom's sketches, his tactical mind analyzing the logistics. How do we connect pieces this size? Our fusion welders won't work on unknown materials, and we don't have mechanical fasteners rated for these weights. Tom had been thinking about the same problem. The shells themselves might give us the answer. Look at these edge patterns. They're not smooth. There are ridges and grooves, almost like they're designed to lock together. Anne ran her scanner along the edge of a shell fragment, paying close attention to the detailed surface structure. Tom, you're right. These patterns are too regular to be natural wear. It's almost like they evolved to connect with other shells. Or were designed to, Tom said. If the Krex were builders, their shells would need to work as construction materials. Grandmother spoke again, and Pip translated with growing excitement. She say great ones could make shells soft when needed, hard when needed. They use heat from deep earth to shape shells like clay, then let cool to become stone strong. This information changed everything. If they could find a way to soften the shell material, they could reshape it, create custom connections, build exactly what they needed. The volcanic vents, Anne said suddenly. There are geothermal sites all around this area. If heat makes the shell material workable, Tom was already planning the next steps. We need to test this. Take some smaller pieces to a heat source. See if we can make them soft enough to work with. Captain Ross looked at his watch, calculating time and resources. This is still a massive undertaking. Even if we can shape the shells we're talking, about moving hundreds of tons of material across difficult terrain. Then we better get started, Tom said. By midday, they had transported several shell fragments to a nearby geothermal vent. The natural heat source reached temperatures of over 300 degrees, hot enough to make most metals glow red. Tom used improvised tools to hold a shell piece near the heat source, watching for any signs of change. After 20 minutes of exposure, the shell material began to behave differently. The rigid surface became slightly flexible, like thick leather, instead of stone. Anne monitored the process with her instruments, recording every detail. "The molecular structure is actually changing," she reported. "The heat breaks down some kind of crystalline matrix, making the whole material plastic." Tom carefully removed the heated shell from the vent and found he could bend and shape it with hand tools. The material held whatever form he gave it, and, as it cooled, it returned to its original hardness. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with growing excitement. "This is how we build our bridge." Pip watched the demonstration with obvious amazement, his skin cycling through colors Anne had never seen before. When Tom successfully reshaped a piece of ancient Krex shell, the young alien made sounds of wonder. "Sky people truly have builder spirit," Pip said. "Grandmother right. You make path across death waters." That evening, as they planned their construction project, Tom felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. 200 lives depended on their success, but for the first time since arriving at the swamp, he believed they had a real chance. The Krex had left them more than just indestructible shells. They had left them the tools and knowledge needed to accomplish the impossible. Now it was up to human ingenuity to put those tools to work. The sound of metal cutting through ancient shell filled the morning air as Tom Bradley worked over the geothermal vent. Sweat dripped from his face despite the cool morning temperature. The heated Krex shell material responded to his tools like thick clay, allowing him to carve channels and grooves that would let the pieces lock together perfectly. Anne Foster documented every step of the process, her scientific training demanding careful records of their techniques. They had discovered that different shell sections required different heating times. The thicker pieces needed nearly an hour of exposure to become workable, while the thinner edges softened in just minutes. "The interlocking system is brilliant," Anne observed, watching Tom shape a connecting joint. "Once these pieces cool and harden, they'll distribute weight across the entire structure instead of creating stress points." Captain Ross supervised the movement of shell fragments to their work area. His team had rigged a simple but effective transport system using their vehicle winches and metal poles as levers. Even their strongest lifting equipment struggled with the massive shell pieces, but human determination found ways to move what seemed immovable. "We're burning through our power cells faster than expected," Ross reported. "The heating process takes more energy than our portable generators can sustain indefinitely." Tom paused in his work, considering the problem. "How long can we maintain this pace?" "Maybe 2 days at full power. After that, we'll need to ration energy usage." This was troubling news. Tom's calculations showed they needed at least 4 days to shape and connect enough shells to reach across the swamp. But human engineering had always been about solving problems with limited resources. "We work in shifts," Tom decided. "Heat multiple pieces during peak generator hours, then work on assembly and finishing during low power periods. We make every bit of energy count." Pip arrived with more Keth volunteers, young adults who had overcome their traditional fear of the swamp to help the Sky people. His grandmother had declared this work blessed by the spirits of the Great Ones, which gave the helpers courage to approach the deadly waters. "More hands for carrying," Pip announced. "Grandmother say Great Ones would want their shells used to save lives." The additional help made a significant difference. The Keth were smaller than humans, but surprisingly strong, and their natural balance allowed them to work safely on unstable ground near the swamp's edge. They could not handle the heated shells directly, but they excelled at positioning pieces and holding them steady while Tom made connections. By the third day, their floating causeway extended 50 meters into the swamp. The connected shell platforms rode the acidic water like a series of large rafts, rising and falling with the liquid's movement but remaining perfectly stable. The sight filled Tom with pride and growing confidence. Anne tested each section as it was completed, walking carefully across the shell's surface while monitoring for any signs of structural weakness. The material showed no degradation despite constant exposure to acid and heat. "It's working better than I hoped," she reported. "The shells are actually getting stronger in the acid environment. Something in the swamp chemistry is reinforcing the molecular bonds." Captain Ross studied their progress through binoculars, calculating distances and remaining work. "We're a quarter of the way across. If we can maintain this pace, we'll reach the other side with a day to spare." But maintaining the pace proved more difficult than anyone expected. The swamp fought them at every step. Acid vapors corroded their tools faster than anticipated. The unstable shoreline made it increasingly difficult to position their heating equipment. Worst of all, the shells became harder to find as they worked their way through the readily available fragments. "We're running low on suitable pieces," Tom admitted during a brief rest break. "The remaining fragments are either too small or too damaged to use as primary supports." Anne had been studying this problem with her characteristic scientific thoroughness. "There are larger pieces deeper in the rocky areas, but they're buried under years of mineral deposits. We'll need to excavate them." This meant additional work with tools not designed for heavy excavation. Captain Ross organized his team into shifts, some working on the bridge while others dug shell fragments from their rocky graves. The process was slow and exhausting, but it yielded the materials they desperately needed. Pip proved invaluable during this phase, his knowledge of local geology helping them locate the best excavation sites. His people had stories about where the largest great ones had fallen, and these stories translated into rich deposits of shell fragments. "Grandmother say biggest shells under the singing rocks," Pip explained, leading them to an area where underground gas vents created haunting musical sounds. The singing rocks yielded shell pieces larger than any they had found previously. Some fragments were big enough to serve as major platform sections, reducing the total number of pieces they needed to shape and connect. Tom worked through the night, using portable lights to continue shaping connections after the sun set. His hands were raw from handling heated shell material, and his back ached from hours of detailed work, but the sight of their growing causeway drove him forward. "You need to rest," Anne told him during one of his rare breaks. "You're pushing yourself too hard." 200 people are counting on us," Tom replied, returning to his workstation. "I can rest after they're safe." By dawn of the fourth day, their bridge stretched nearly halfway across the swamp. The connected shell platforms created a stable pathway that rose and fell with the acid waves, but never threatened to break apart. Keth volunteers had taken over much of the routine work, allowing Tom to focus on the most critical connections. Captain Ross brought news that changed their timeline completely. Weather reports show the storm front accelerating. "We have 18 hours before conditions become impossible for any rescue operation. 18 hours to complete a project that had originally seemed impossible." Tom looked across the remaining expanse of boiling water, calculating distances and connection requirements. It would require everything they had learned, every technique they had developed, and a level of sustained effort that pushed human endurance to its limits. "Then we work until it's done," Tom said simply. Anne began preparing their remaining shell materials for rapid processing. The Keth volunteers organized themselves into efficient work teams. Captain Ross coordinated logistics and supply management. Everyone understood that the next 18 hours would determine whether their impossible project succeeded or failed. As the sun climbed higher in the orange sky, Tom shaped another connection joint and fitted it carefully into place. The causeway grew longer with each piece, reaching like a human-built finger across the deadly swamp toward the stranded colonists who waited for rescue on the far shore. Behind him, the Keth sang traditional work songs that their people had used during the time of the Great Ones. The melodies seemed to give rhythm to their movements and strength to their efforts. For the first time in centuries, the Death Waters echoed with sounds of construction and hope instead of fear and despair. The bridge was no longer just an engineering project. It had become a symbol of what different species could accomplish when they worked together toward a common goal. The middle section of the swamp tested every limit of human endurance and alien cooperation. Tom Bradley stood on the furthest completed platform, surrounded by acidic mist so thick he could barely see his own hands. The protective gear that had seemed adequate near the shore was failing rapidly in the concentrated poison of the swamp's center. "Filtration system is down to 30% efficiency," Ann Foster called out, her voice muffled by her breathing mask. "We can't work out here much longer without better protection." The causeway now stretched 3/4 of the way across the deadly water, but this final section presented challenges they had not anticipated. The acid concentration was nearly twice as strong as near the shoreline. The temperature had risen to over 200 degrees, hot enough to cause severe burns through their protective suits. Worst of all, the swamp bottom in this area proved completely unstable, making it impossible to anchor their work platforms. Captain Ross coordinated the supply chain from a safer position 50 meters back, using voice communication to stay in contact with the forward work teams. "Tom, the latest shell shipment is ready, but we're having trouble getting it to your position. The platforms are flexing more than expected." Tom wiped condensation from his helmet visor and studied the problem. The increased temperature and acid concentration was affecting even the Krex shells. While still incredibly durable, the material was expanding and contracting with the thermal changes, creating gaps between platform sections. "We need a different approach," Tom decided. "Instead of rigid connections, we create flexible joints that can move with the thermal expansion." This meant redesigning their joining system while working in the most hostile environment any of them had ever encountered. Tom used heated tools to carve new connection channels that would allow controlled movement between shell pieces. The work required precise measurements and careful shaping, all while toxic vapors ate away at everything around them. Pip and his Keth volunteers could not work directly in the center section. The alien physiology was even more sensitive to the acid vapors than human biology, but they found other ways to help, creating supply chains and support systems that kept the humans working at maximum efficiency. "Sky people stronger than stories, say," Pip observed, watching the work teams struggle through conditions that would kill most life forms in minutes. Great ones would be proud. The breakthrough came when Anne made a crucial discovery about the swamp's chemistry. While analyzing water samples, she found that certain native plants produced a neutralizing compound that could reduce the acid's effectiveness. "These root systems are actually filtering the acid," she explained to Tom during a brief rest period. "If we can extract and concentrate the neutralizing agent, we could create a protective coating for the shell connections." Tom immediately saw the implications. A biological treatment that works with the shells instead of against the environment. "Can you produce enough?" Anne was already calculating requirements. "The plants are everywhere around the swamp's edge. With Pip's people helping to harvest, we could have enough neutralizer in a few hours." While Anne worked on her chemical solution, Tom faced a more immediate crisis. Two of their major platform sections had developed stress fractures where the thermal expansion was greatest. The cracks were small but growing, threatening to break the causeway at its most critical point. "The fractures are spreading," Captain Ross reported from his observation position. "If those sections fail, we lose everything we've built." Tom made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of trying to repair the damaged sections, he would redesign them to work with the stress instead of against it. "We're going to cut the platforms into smaller sections," he announced. "Create articulated joints that can flex and move without breaking." This meant partially dismantling work they had already completed, but it was the only way to create a structure that could survive the swamp's extreme conditions. Tom worked feverishly with his cutting tools, breaking the large platforms into interconnected smaller pieces that could bend and twist without structural failure. The Keth volunteers arrived with Anne's neutralizing compound just as Tom finished the redesign work. The biological treatment proved remarkably effective, creating a protective layer that reduced acid damage by over 70%. "It works like a living shield," Anne explained as they applied the treatment to each shell surface. "The plant compounds actually get stronger when exposed to acid, creating a self-reinforcing barrier." With the new protection and flexible design, the causeway construction accelerated rapidly. Tom and his team worked through the afternoon and into the evening, driven by the knowledge that the storm front was only hours away. The most dangerous moment came when Tom personally had to cross a gap between platform sections to position a critical connecting piece. The gap was only 2 meters wide, but it opened directly over the deepest and most acidic part of the swamp. One slip would mean instant death. "Tom, wait for the safety line," Captain Ross called out, but Tom was already moving. The jump was perfect, landing squarely on the target platform. But as Tom worked to position the connecting shell, his tool slipped from hands made clumsy by the thick protective gloves. The heated metal fell toward the acid below. Without thinking, Tom lunged forward to catch the tool, overbalancing himself and tumbling toward the deadly water. His protective suit caught on the edge of the shell platform, leaving him hanging, upside down just inches above the boiling acid. Pip appeared at the platform edge faster than anyone thought possible, his small but strong hands gripping Tom's suit harness. The young Keth could not lift a full-grown human alone, but he held on while Captain Ross and Anne rushed to help with the rescue. "Not let Sky Builder fall," Pip said through gritted teeth, his skin flashing the bright red that meant maximum effort. They pulled Tom to safety just as his suit fabric began to smoke from the acid vapors. The near disaster showed everyone how close to the edge they were working, but it also demonstrated the unbreakable bond that had formed between human and Keth workers. "Thank you," Tom said to Pip once his breathing returned to normal. "You saved my life." Pip's skin showed the soft green of satisfaction and friendship. Sky people save Pip people by building bridge. Pip people save Sky people by keeping builders safe. This is good trade. As darkness fell, portable lights illuminated their work area like a constellation floating on the poisonous water. The final platform sections were taking shape, and the end of the swamp was finally visible in the distance. Tom stood on the growing causeway and looked back toward where they had started. The shell bridge stretched behind them like a miracle made real, a testament to human engineering and alien cooperation. Tomorrow they would complete the crossing and reach the stranded colonists. But tonight, they had already achieved something that would be remembered long after the rescue was complete. They had proven that no barrier was truly impassable when different species worked together with shared determination and mutual respect. The death water still boiled around them, still filled the air with poison, still challenged everything. They did. But the swamp was no longer unconquerable. Humans had found a way through, and in doing so, had opened possibilities that neither species had imagined before. The first drops of acid rain began falling as Tom Bradley placed the final shell piece into position. The storm that had driven their desperate timeline was beginning to arrive, but the causeway was complete. A continuous path of interlocked Krek's shells now stretched across the entire expanse of boiling swamp, connecting two sides that had been separated for centuries. Anne Foster ran her final structural tests, her instruments confirming what her eyes could already see. The bridge was stable, flexible, and strong enough to support multiple crossings. The shell platforms rose and fell gently with the acid waves, but the connections held firm. "All readings are green," she announced to the team. "The causeway can handle whatever load we need to put on it." Captain Ross organized the crossing procedure with military precision. The stranded colonists on the far shore had been contacted by radio and were preparing for evacuation. 200 people would need to cross the bridge in groups small enough to maintain safety, but large enough to complete the evacuation before the storm made travel impossible. Pip stood at the beginning of the causeway with his grandmother and several other elder Keth. The old female spoke at length in their native language, her words carrying the weight of ceremony and historical significance. "Grandmother say this day changes everything for Keth people," Pip translated. "For 1,000 seasons, death waters divide our world. Now sky people and Keth people together make new world possible." Tom felt the responsibility of the moment settling over him like a heavy cloak. This bridge represented more than just a rescue mission. It was a symbol of cooperation between species, a demonstration that seemingly impossible problems could be solved through determination and mutual respect. The first group of colonists appeared at the far end of the causeway, their figures barely visible through the thickening acid mist. They moved carefully but confidently across the shell platforms, testing each step before committing their full weight. The bridge held perfectly, its flexible design adapting to the changing conditions without any sign of stress. "It's working," Captain Ross said, his voice filled with relief and admiration. "They're actually crossing." As the first colonists reached the safe shore, Tom could see the amazement in their faces. These people had been trapped for weeks, facing slow starvation or death, and now they walked across a bridge made from materials that had existed on the planet for centuries, but had never been used this way before. Dr. Lisa Chen, the senior colonist leader, was among the first group to cross. She approached Tom with tears in her eyes, her voice shaking with emotion. "We thought we were going to die over there," she said. "When we saw your bridge, we couldn't believe it was real. How did you manage something like this?" Tom looked back. Across the causeway, watching more groups of colonists making their way to safety. "We had help. The Keth people, the materials left by the Kreks, and mostly just refusing to accept that some problems can't be solved." The evacuation continued through the morning as the storm intensified around them. Acid rain fell more heavily, but the neutralizing compound Anne had developed protected both the bridge and the people crossing it. The shell platforms proved remarkably stable even in the worsening conditions. By midday, all 200 colonists had crossed to safety. The bridge had not only succeeded, it had exceeded every expectation. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save lives had become a permanent transportation route that would change the entire planet. The rescued colonists set up temporary shelters, while they waited for transport off-world, but many expressed interest in staying to help develop the bridge site. The successful crossing had opened up vast areas of the planet that had been inaccessible for generations. Pip's grandmother made a formal announcement to the gathered Keth, declaring the bridge a sacred site, blessed by the spirits of the Great Ones. In their language, she named it Thekvar Neth Korundai, which translated roughly to the Bridge of Sky-Touched Ones. "This name will be remembered in all Keth stories," Pip explained to Tom. "When young ones ask how Death Waters was crossed, they will learn about humans who refuse to accept impossible." Anne established a research station at the bridge approach, studying both the Kreks shells and the swamp ecosystem. Her discoveries about the neutralizing compounds led to breakthroughs in protective materials that would benefit both species for generations to come. "The shells aren't just construction material," she explained to a gathering of scientists and engineers. "They're part of a complete biological system that evolved to work with this environment instead of fighting against it." Captain Ross coordinated the logistics of establishing permanent support facilities for the bridge. Supply stations, emergency shelters, and communication relay points were positioned at regular intervals across the causeway. What had been built as a desperate rescue operation was becoming the foundation of a new transportation network. 3 months later, Tom found himself teaching young Keth how to work with heated shell material. The aliens had natural artistic abilities that translated perfectly to shell shaping, and they developed techniques that even Tom had not imagined. "Sky people show us shells can be shaped," said Kem, one of Pip's cousins who had shown remarkable skill with the heated material. "But Keth people learned to make shells sing." Tom watched in amazement as Kem created delicate sound chambers within the shell walls, producing haunting musical tones when the acid wind passed through them. The bridge was becoming more than functional infrastructure. It was evolving into a work of art that celebrated both species' contributions. Trade routes that had been impossible for centuries began operating within weeks of the bridge's completion. Keth communities on both sides of the swamp established regular exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. The deathworlders, which had divided their civilization for so long, became a connection point instead of a barrier. Human colonists who had initially planned to leave the planet decided to stay and work with the Keth on expanding the shell working techniques. New settlements sprang up around major shell deposits, becoming centers of joint research and development. The success story spread beyond the planet itself. Other human colonies, facing seemingly impossible environmental challenges, sent representatives to study the bridge-building techniques. The combination of human engineering persistence and willingness to work with alien materials and knowledge became a model for problem-solving across multiple worlds. Pip, now recognized as a bridge expert in his own right, traveled to other Keth communities to share the knowledge. His grandmother's stories about the Great Ones had evolved to include new chapters about the Sky People who brought the ancient ways back to life. Great Ones built first bridges, Pip would tell audiences of both humans and Keth. Sky People and Keth people together build bridges for future. 6 months after the first crossing, Tom stood on the center platform of the bridge during sunset. The causeway bustled with activity as traders, researchers, and travelers moved back and forth across what had once been an impassable barrier. The shell platforms had developed their own ecosystem, with small plants taking root in the protective crevices and creating tiny gardens in the middle of the acid swamp. Anne joined him, carrying her latest research findings. "The bridge is actually improving the swamp environment," she reported. "The shell platforms are filtering the acid, gradually reducing the toxicity levels across the entire area." This was an unexpected benefit that no one had predicted. The Krex shells, working as the Great Ones had intended, were slowly healing the environmental damage that had made the swamp so deadly. "Maybe that's what the Krex were trying to do originally," Tom mused. "Not just cross the water, but restore it to something livable." Captain Ross approached with news from the Colonial Administration. "They want to make this a permanent installation with full support staff. You'll have unlimited resources to expand the bridge network across the entire continent." Tom considered the offer carefully. The project had grown far beyond anything he had imagined when they first faced the impossible crossing. But the work was just beginning. There were other swamps, other barriers, other problems that could be solved with the right combination of human determination and alien knowledge. "I'll stay," Tom decided, "but only if Pip and his people are full partners in whatever we build next." The young Keth's skin flashed the brilliant blue that meant joy and agreement. Pip people and Sky people build together, make all impossible things possible. As the orange sun set behind them, painting the acid mist in shades of gold and crimson, Tom reflected on what they had accomplished. They had not just built a bridge across a deadly swamp. They had created a symbol of what different species could achieve when they refused to accept limitations and worked together with mutual respect and shared purpose. The deathwaters still bubbled and steamed around them, but they no longer seemed threatening. They had become part of a larger system, a challenge that had been met and overcome through cooperation and ingenuity. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new impossibilities to solve. But tonight, the bridge stood as proof that human determination, combined with alien wisdom and materials, could overcome any obstacle the universe presented. The causeway stretched away in both directions, its shell platforms glowing softly in the fading light. Travelers moved across it safely, carrying goods and ideas between communities that had been separated for centuries. The bridge had become exactly what its builders had intended: a path across the impossible, connecting not just two shores but two species in a partnership that would last for generations. In the distance, young Keth voices could be heard singing the new bridge songs that celebrated the day the Sky People and the Earth People together conquered the Death Waters and opened a new chapter in both their histories.